here to argue that to build peace and reconstruct after disasters, we need our communities. And with that, the question is, what's community? Well, community is a verb, as the organizers of this TEDx coined for this wonderful gathering. Community is where it all happens, and community makes it happen. I will go one level up. Community is probably the most important capital in most circumstances. So that's a big claim to make, right? Like peace, the real value of community is best appreciated, best understood at times of its absence. In circumstances of conflict and disasters, the value of community as a verb seems to strike home really hard, making us realize that what seems to be given, ignored, taken for granted, and often undervalued is, in fact, what we have to build a new future. I'm a professor of peace and conflict studies, and since mid-1990s, I've been investigating the most effective ways of building peace in divided societies. And with that, my work is about how conflict can be prevented or resolved, or how we can build peace. But the most critical question there is, who should build peace and how? Right. It was mid-1990s, and the Cold War was well over, and its ramifications were still being felt throughout the world. The states that were held together by the bipolar system had started to dissolve, and one of the states of that kind was Bosnia and Herzegovina within former Yugoslavia. And at the time, it was mid-1990s, I was doing my PhD. I was investigating how we can use physical reconstruction as a tool for peace building. So I headed to Bosnia and Herzegovina in former Yugoslavia, and there I focus on a beautiful town called Mostar. After Mostar, I will take you to Liberia, where we are going to focus on the reintegration of child soldiers back to in their communities. And after that, I will take you back home, New Orleans, 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit and caused the single most catastrophic natural disaster in US history. So, are you ready for this journey?
Yeah.
Good. So, the last stop is Mostar. The footbridge of Mostar, Stari Most, was built by Turks in the 16th century, and it always symbolized the point of unification, connection, and living side by side. It was such an important place in Mostar that, for example, young people gathered every spring to celebrate the arrival of spring and dive into the cool waters of River Neretva. It was a place where newly wedded couples got their first photos taken. It was a place where all these different ethno-religious populations intermingled with each other. Because what it represented for peace, it came under direct attack from the Croat forces for 3 months in 1993 in order to trap the Muslim population on the other side further. Bit by bit, they destroyed the bridge. Bit by bit, they took the memory of living together from the people of Mostar. So a peace agreement was signed in Dayton in 1995, started the peace process. And that's also led to one of the most elaborate physical reconstruction projects in the country. The international community took this project almost like a pet project. They really want to show everybody that they were ready to reconnect the divided communities of Mostar. And in this process, no expense was spared. Money was no issue. In fact, many actors from the European Union to US and Turkey, they were all prepared to sign a blank check for its reconstruction. And the physical reconstruction itself was probably the best practice examples. The process witnessed the application of underwater archaeology in order to understand how the foundations of the bridge were built originally. The mortar that was used 400 years ago was replicated. And stonemasons were brought from Turkey in order to use the same stone cutting techniques as done originally. So, a great job as far as the physical reconstruction is concerned. But one thing they forgot. They forgot to bring divided communities in that reconstruction process. So when the newly rebuilt bridge was reopened in 2004, there were many dignitaries from over 50 countries, presidents, ministers, ambassadors, so on. But there were hardly anybody from Mostar. They were very happy to see that their beloved bridge was finally rebuilt. Don't take me wrong, they were happy. But they didn't really have the same sense of ownership of the bridge as was the before the war. And that was largely because the bridge didn't represent what it was for them before the war. And with that, that was a big challenge for the international community. And to change that, the whole thing, they needed to realize that to rebuild a community, you need to rebuild hearts. And for the reconstruction of hearts, you got to engage them in that reconstruction process so that they could heal, they could regain their dignity, and they could rebuild their own bridges between hearts and souls. That's why it was so important. And unfortunately, the people of Mostar couldn't say, we did it together. Liberia is a small West African country which was in war from 1989 to 1993, and then from 1997 to 2003. Over 250,000 people were killed and many more displaced. And a population of 5 million was torn apart. At the end of war, over 100,000 Liberians registered themselves as ex-combatants. Out of this 100,000 ex-combatants, 30% of them were women, and 40% of them reported that they were under the age of 18 when they joined the war. So at the end of war, there were over 20,000 child soldiers, which had really, most of them had no home to return. And that was the dilemma, right? What would you do with these child soldiers and they have no home to go back to? And there, the role of communities was imperative, their willingness to accept them back. Because with ex-combatants, the provision of employment of some sort is really important, which breaks down the dependency on warlords and criminality. But they really need new sociocultural structures to build a civilian life. For the engagement of communities in that process, I think the hardest point was really whether or not they would be willing and ready for that. Even some of those families didn't want to accept their children back to their communities. That was the kind of like the severity of the problem. You know, some didn't want the hassle. It was too much for them to deal with in that post-conflict environment. For some, I mean, they feared that if they accepted those ex-combatants in their villages, they can be excluded themselves from the community. Some, they thought that, well, those ex-combatants, after their return, they may start kind of the old means of violence. And some even thought that ex-combatants' souls were just so tainted that there would be no local rituals to cleanse them back. And with that kind of environment, one of the key things is that, and in fact, luckily, for most ex-combatants there, the majority of communities didn't feel like that. They want to give peace a chance. So I talked to a group of women in an isolated village in northwestern part of the country, and I asked them what motivated them, you know, to accept ex-combatants in their community. What they said to me, I think, just summarizes the whole thing. They said, we want peace, and this is the only way we can get it, because only with us, those ex-combatants can relearn how to live in peace. And this reminds me of a beautiful African proverb. Probably most of you might have heard this before. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that really summarizes the significance of the fact that in post-conflict Liberia, ex-combatants and receiving communities had to live together. And the sociocultural resources of the community was needed to deal with that challenge. And that was the significance of the community and its role in the reintegration process in Liberia. So that also reminds me another beautiful African proverb, Ubuntu, which says, I am because we are. I really want you to think about that for a second. That's a really beautiful proverb. It really makes the connection between us as individuals and also our communities and what that means, especially in terms of what makes us as an individual and the way our communities play such an important role. So for the reintegration of child soldiers, ex-combatants in Liberia, you couldn't do this. Community had to be playing that central role. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, that was an environment of confusion, especially around the roles of state and federal roles in response to this disaster. And it's also really interesting that there were so many warnings from agencies, international agencies particularly, for impending disaster coming days before Katrina's landfall. So we knew that this was coming. But that was because that total collapse of leadership, you know, the confusion and the frustration, there was hardly any proper emergency planning application. And there was poor communication. There was poor decision making, which led a really, it wasn't only a disaster because of Hurricane Katrina. It was a disaster because there was no proper response to the disaster. The response itself was more disastrous than what caused by that natural disaster, right? So in that environment, the surviving members of the community in New Orleans and surrounding areas, they were the ones who helped. And they had to, because it was their families, neighbors, and friends who needed help. They helped as much and as well as they could, but they did. And I think this is really important. Now, we've been to 3 places: Mostar, Liberia, and New Orleans. And I think all this experience shows us that we need to invest in communities, with communities, and for communities. And that really should be the way forward. And this is particularly important as we are now entering in an increased level of uncertainty in the post-COVID-19 world. And there are a number of factors for that. So there are many geopolitical shifts, climate change, natural resource depletion, mass migration. There's an increased level of polarization, autocratization, militarization. And on top of that, as they are not enough, there are new threats emerging because of the mind-boggling speed of technology and the way technology is used for destructive means. So in an environment like that, we need our communities to rebuild, reinvigorate, and reimagine our future. Finally, don't romanticize community. I think community needs scrutiny as much as it needs our tender, loving care, right? I think both of them is important because often, community seems that almost like a secret formula, recipe for all ills that we face in our society. Oh, well, community participation. Oh, well, community empowerment. Oh, community would deal with that. Well, community is who we are. And none of us is perfect, right? So our community is not perfect either. So we really need to understand what our community is about before we can build on it. So with that, I'm resting my case to you. Thank you.